So let's talk about if and else if statements in Python. And actually, before even we get started there, let's talk about different type of statements in Python in general. I'm going to switch over to Atom real fast here. And for most part, we've seen quite a different type of statements already. We've seen a assignment statement, like so. We've seen a print statement where we've printed a simple string like hello world, or we have used the format statement or format method to format the output of a numeric value so far. We've also seen an assignment statement where we have assigned a list or a dictionary or a tuple, or even opened a file. So most of these, all of these statements have a specific purpose, and they have their own syntaxes and rules that they have to follow. So in case of an assignment statement, the syntax is that you have a variable to the left followed by an equal sign, and then followed by a value for that assignment. Whether that value is a list in this case, a string value here, or an integer value here, that doesn't matter, as long as they follow their individual rules as well, such as a list have to be comma separated in a square brackets, a string value is within a single or a double quote, or an integer value is just an integer value. Now, for assignment purposes, we've so far seen only statements of such example, where you've assigned one variable to one value. You could assign multiple variables in a single statement by using comma separated values. So you can say a comma b comma c, and we could say assign individual values to these. So the syntax here is your variables on the left equal sign, and to make sure that the number of values being assigned are equal to the number of variables that you have. So if I do this and say print A, B, and C, and if I just run this part of the code, and sure enough we have the values that we assigned, which was 2, 3, and 5. If you wanted to assign a single variable or single value to all these variables, unfortunately in Python you can't do something like this. You can't say A, B, and C are all equal to 0. This in fact will throw an error, and we'll say iterator object is not, or integer object, which is this, is not iteratable. So how do you assign multiple variables a single value? Well, you could do this. You can say A is equal to B, and that's equal to C, and they are all set to the value 0, and if I just run that, sure enough A, B, and C have been overwritten to 0. And there is another way to do this, A, B, C equal to 0 to mimic this statement here, and I'm going to leave that for a quiz question for you guys to figure out. Okay, so these were assignment statements. Now we've also seen syntaxes of calling methods and functions already. We've used the split method in case of when we were working with strings. We've seen functions like string of 0, right? Or we've seen a function called int of the string 0. So these are functions. We'll pass in an argument, and then whatever value gets returned, we can either print them or store them to a variable, right? We've done that. We have looked at various methods. In case of regular expressions, we had a method called sub or compile. We have seen a method called count in case of lists and strings, which is the method count was common to that, which accepted one variable and returned the number of times that element occurred within the list or the string, or I think even a tuple. And in case of dictionaries, we had looked at a get method, which would produce, which would take in a variable and return whether or not the value of that key, if it exists. If not, it will return none, or if we passed in a additional parameter, then it will pass in that value. right? So we've seen all of that. So those are some of the forms of simple syntaxes and sort of, or simple statements in terms of assignments or print statements, and complex statements such as calling a method for a particular object or calling a function in case of strings and integers. So let's take a look at another complex statement, and let's start with our if statements here. So let me just write this if statement first, right? So it's going to say if A is less than B, then do work 1, else do work 2. And if you come from another programming background such as C, Java, or Perl, you would have an example that, or you would, a comparable if statement would look something like this, right? It would say if A less than B, open brace, then you have do work 1, else do work 2, right? So let's compare, let's not forget our semicolons here. So let's compare these two different syntaxes that are between Perl or between Python and some of the other classic languages. So one, in Python, these parentheses around these if statements are actually not required. You could simply write that, and that would work. However, I strongly recommend you use parentheses around these. For one, it makes it great while reading your statements. You know exactly what is contained. And if you write chain statements or you chain using various operators, it's again easy to understand that you're comparing these two values first, then comparing something else here, and so on and so forth. So parentheses, although not required, highly recommended. Second thing, notice between some of the classic languages and Python is that, let me just replace this here. I'm going to say print A and print B. Well, you'll notice this everywhere else too. So notice that there's, at the end of the line, there's no semicolon. In C, C, C++, Java, Perl, these are required. They indicate an end of a statement. In terms of Python, a new line character almost always indicates a end of a statement. Now you could use semicolons if you wanted to. There's no harm. Python's not going to throw an error. Well, I'm just going to erase this guy for now. And if we were to just run this, you know, what did we have? Print A is not defined. It's because we have these errors up ahead. Let's remove some of this. Now just run this block, right? So there it is. Let me remove this part as well, just to make things easier to read. Okay, right? So if A is less than B, print A. Well, sure enough, the value of B is 4, so it will print that. So you are allowed to write these semicolons, and in fact, if you were to write multiple statements within one line, such as A is equal to 2, print A, and B is equal to 4, or B is equal to 5. If I were to do something like that and run that statement, still valid. Well, let me rewrite this to say 10, just so we know that we're doing the right stuff. So that is still valid, but highly recommend you do not do this. For one, it makes it a nightmare to read this when you're writing and debugging somebody else's code. So if you write this in such a way, please don't do it. Write one statement at a time. You're definitely not wasting any paper when you're writing your code, unless you're printing it, and I'm not sure why would you do that. Nonetheless, I digress. And lastly, let's bring our if statement back from the world of Perl. right? Right. So notice that within Python, there are no curly braces, right? In Python, the blocks are actually identified by indentations. So, and that's but that is purposely chosen, that syntax is because you could write in Perl, C, Java, you can write things like this, right? And I have definitely seen work of such sorts. So I can say that. Now, if you're writing or reading a program or trying to debug something that is hundreds of lines long, that gets very confusing. You have no idea where that print statement is, and now in this case it's just one. But imagine there are 10, 15, 20, 30 statements within this else or this if statement or nested if and else statements. It gets really, really difficult to figure that out. So if I were to do something like this, if I can type correctly and see, right? Now what? Which else statement does this belong to? Is it to this if or to that if? This gets very nasty and very fast. And because in C, Perl, and Java, all blocks are open and closed with curly braces, this kind of works in terms of compiling and running the code, but reading wise, it's a nightmare. So purposely in Python, indentations were created as blocks so people don't write code as such, and make sure they're indented. Now, if based on what your programming background is and how much you like to type or not type, in Perl you're definitely typing less than what you would do in other languages. But these indentations, well, they could be a nightmare or a blessing. If you ask me, well, I'm pleading the fifth. So, well, let's take a look at an example of what can happen with the indentations, right? So for one, you want to always stay consistent with your indentations, and indentations could be used. You can either use spaces or tabs, but don't mix and match within your code because it can get very, very nasty fast. What if I said something like this? If A is greater than B, print A, whoops, and print C, right? My intent is to print A and C only if A is greater than B and nothing else. Now, if I were to run this part of the code, I will get an error message because Python doesn't understand where this print C statement should be, whether it should be within the block of if or outside the block of if, right? Did you mean to have this indented within the if block and not this? So over here I had two spaces, over here I had a tab. So don't do that. Be very, very careful about these indentations and be mindful of them, especially when you're writing large programs. Right, and the other problem with that is by default when Python prints out these error messages, they don't actually print out what the line number within the program your error is. So when you have errors like these, they can get very tough to track down and debug. Okay, so for the few rules to remember are that for assignment statements or for simple statements such as print and assignment, one statement at a line. Semicolons are not required, but unless you're writing multiple statements in a single line, you can use semicolon to separate each statement. For complex statements such as if, for loops, while loops, you have your header line. These are called header lines, by the way, and then they're followed by a colon, and then the block or set of statements to be followed within that condition are to be indented. And in case of indentation, just be consistent whether you indent using spaces or tabs, and whether they are 2 or 4 spaces. In general, I prefer to have tabs, and 1 tab equals 4 spaces, right? There are few exceptions to these 2 rules. Exception number 1, that if you are writing a statement which has, say, parentheses or square brackets or curly braces, say for example you are declaring a dictionary, and your dictionary definition is quite large, you could actually break that up over multiple lines, right? So you can say dictionary A is equal to 1. I can then say B is 2 and C is 3. I could do that, and then I can say print my dictionary. If I were to run this bit of code, that still works and it's valid. So although I broke up the statements here and different line, it's still a single statement, because in terms of dictionary, the starting and end of a dictionary declaration is defined by curly braces. Similar for list, you could use square brackets or parentheses as well. So that's an exception to having one statement on a single line. And you can also do that for if statements or for loops. If you were to say, if A is less than B, and I can say B is greater than C, then print C. And if I were to run this bit, that will work. Of course it doesn't work in this case. That's because we need another parentheses around to indicate that this whole thing is a single statement. If I run that, whoops, if I run that, that will work. And that's because A is not defined. Let's copy this guy here. Sorry about this, guys. There, right? So if A is less than B, let me just do this. Else print no. And now if I run this, yeah, that statement works, right? So as long as you have your statements wrapped around parentheses or curly braces or square braces, you can break them up into multiple lines. It doesn't have to be in a single line. That kind of helps, especially when you're declaring dictionaries. When you have long keys or long values, it's easier to break this up and easier to read your code as well. Second statement or second exception to these header statements is that your indentations or your next statement, as long as it's a simple statement, you can write it all as a one-liner. You can say something like this: if A less than B, then print C, right? If I were to do this, that will work, because this is considered as a simple statement. Whatever's following by the colon is a simple single statement, and that would work. Whether you are printing, whether you are creating an assignment or calling a function, that will work. But this will not work. If I say print A, this is not a valid statement and it will complain. In this case, you will have to break this up into multiple statements like so. And if I were to run this, I have to run all of this here, that will work, right? So few exceptions to the rule of how to declare statements per line and how to have a simple statement versus a complex statement, whether it's an if statement, for loops, or while loops.